Hi guys, this is Mike. Welcome back to 𝗪𝗵𝗹𝗍's Guide to Special Forces Assessment and Selection. Today we're going to talk about physical preparation, principles and overall concept.
Superb comfort, unique no-melt, no-drip construction, reliable elbow protection, and fast drying times. This is the Striker X combat shirt.
So today we're going to talk about mission-relevant functional training, because we're trying to get your best possible performance and your best efficiency for the things that you will have to do. So the performance of your body is more than the sum of the body parts. For example, fascia has been thought for a long time to just be basically a plastic bag that keeps the muscle in place. But after a lot more research nowadays, we know that the fascia is actually acting more like an organ that's connecting several muscle groups in a long chain, including all the nerves that connect the muscles. So to increase performance, we will use full body movements through all planes of motion. So that would be in contrast to, for example, if you would train for bodybuilding or for rehab reasons, where you would use isolated muscle movements, or for let's say a simple sport like powerlifting, where you use one-dimensional exercises. So we also would train the muscle through its full spectrum, which would mean concentric, eccentric, and isometric exercises. So the kind of strength we're trying to look for is to get you to be able to lift awkwardly sized objects through all planes of motion. So there's a difference between general physical preparedness, which basically gives you a good baseline of everything, and specific physical preparedness. Specific physical preparedness is the kind of preparedness that, for example, a basketball player trains when he trains the vertical jump, which is very specific to his sport. So for that reason, we will try to figure out what are the specific tasks that you need to be good at. So another principle is that neurons that fire together wire together. For that reason, you're always trying to select movements that actually are applicable to the task that you're going to perform later on. One good technique is super slow repetitions. That means you perform a single movement and you extend the time frame for up to 60 seconds on the concentric phase and the eccentric phase. Since the brain has evolved to be better at complex movements, and it has been shown that complex movements, for example, prevent the aging process in the brain, we are trying to integrate complex movements into our training. Unilateral versus bilateral movement. For example, a bilateral movement would be the squat, versus a unilateral movement that kind of uses the same muscles would be the lunge. Now, I generally prefer unilateral movements because they mimic real life. You don't really find any movements that you would do during your real life that are really bilateral. Very few of them are. Does that mean bilateral movements are a complete waste of time? No. I'm very much a fan of, for example, the power clean for power development. I'm not so much a fan of the squat. I'd rather prefer the single leg squat or the lunge. You should always try to train through the full range of motion, because the joints are built for you to use that full range of motion. And in real life situations, especially if you, for example, have an accident, you will have to be able to use that full range of motion with strength and coordination in order to prevent injuries. The exercises we do will be in all planes of motion. So that's the frontal plane, the sagittal plane, and especially the transversal plane. Because as 𝗏𝗏 says, life happens in the transversal plane. Before you start putting on lots of strength, you need to get rid of any dysfunction. Gray Cook says, don't put strength on top of dysfunction. So for example, if you have a bad range of motion in your squat and you start putting on more and more weight without fixing that range of motion issue, you will eventually get injured. So we want to prevent the injuries in the future by fixing the problems first. Pavel Tsatsouline has coined a phrase, greasing the groove. Now what does that mean? Greasing the groove is a concept which emphasizes that most strength is not built through increasing the diameter of the muscle, but rather by improving the action of the nervous system. So that means you're trying to get the nervous system to be able to activate more muscle fiber instead of growing the muscle fiber themselves. That principle basically says you're trying to do as many repetitions during the day as possible without causing muscle fatigue. You would do that in a way that every single set is intense enough to activate enough muscle fiber, but at the same time does not have too much volume to cause fatigue. So if you are able to do, for example, pull-ups, a total of 5 repetitions, you would train with 2 repetitions per set. And you would do a set, for example, every hour. Then the next day, if you see that that volume was not too much, so you did not cause any fatigue during the day, you could shorten the length between the sets, maybe down to 45 minutes or 30 minutes. As soon as you reach 5 repetitions, you need to increase the intensity to make sure that the intensity is still high enough to recruit enough muscle fiber to increase your strength. Increasing the intensity would be done, for example, if you're doing pull-ups, by adding weight to your pull-ups. If you're a bodybuilder and you want to increase the size of your muscle, you would push your muscle to failure, because that elicits actually growth of the muscle thickness. But if you're training for performance, you don't really want to push the muscle to fatigue, because that would also increase your recovery time, which means you have to put in more rest periods before you can add the next training. And since we know that most training actually happens on a neurological level, so you're trying to get the muscle to work together in a better way, we want to have as many trainings and repetitions as possible. So we're not interested in muscle failure. You also want to be able to recover from failure as quickly as possible. If you do a misstep, if you fall down, if you're in combat and you get pushed or anything that happens to you unexpectedly, you want to recover as quickly as possible and keep going on. So for that reason, we are trying to include things that improve that aspect. Don't do something for nothing. Don't choose an exercise that will only give you a single result. For example, if you want to increase your endurance, you could ride a bike or you could row. But if neither riding the bike nor rowing is part of your selection process, it'll basically be a very one-dimensional thing. If you, instead of that, go rucking or running, which both will most likely be part of your selection process, you will still be training endurance, but at the same time you'll train running technique, rucking technique, you toughen up your feet, you have a multitude of results from one exercise. Many guys think that it's good to be big, so they like to train to look good. But don't worry, form follows function. That means if you are athletic, you will look athletic. And on top of that, you're not an Instagram model, so you have to get your priorities straight. Size is not a bad thing, but remember you have to carry that size. If you have to do a certain amount of pull-ups and you have extra weight that is non-functional because it's only looking good, you're making your life a lot harder. Now later on, you may want to have extra size to absorb impact, like from a crash or an explosion or a bullet hitting you. So in that case, more mass is obviously a little better. Let's talk a little bit about injury prevention in real life. So during training, you should not only focus on having the perfect form all the time, you should also include positions that are slightly off to mimic accidents, okay? Because if in real life, for example, you stumble and you're trying to catch yourself and you have weight on your back, it's much better that if you have trained, for example, lunges in different directions and with different foot positions, than if you had just trained the lunge always the same perfect way, straight forward or straight backward. So obviously the first thing that you have to do is you have to know what to do. That's called technique or motor control. Second thing is, can you do it? Here we're talking about biomechanics and mobility. Your footwear can change your position. It's a good idea to at least sometimes train in the gear that you're working. So if you are usually wearing boots when you're going on a mission, you should sometimes train in boots because it will change the way that movements feel and the way that your feet are actually positioned. Musashi said, make your combat stance your everyday stance. Whenever you do a movement, do it correctly, because every time you do a movement, it will program your nervous system. So if you only try to do a movement correct when it matters, you're not gonna have subconscious control over it. So one example is the squat. I prefer that you will always do full hip extension at the top of the squat instead of just like a half squat. The order in which you train is first you train technique, so you understand the technique. Then you add repetitions until you can perform the technique almost perfectly for, let's say, 15 repetitions. And then you add intensity, so you make it more difficult. Never increase the intensity to a point where your technique suffers. Your technique always has to be good because we are trying to program good technique into you so you can access it subconsciously. So does practice make perfect? Or does practice just make permanent? Does perfect practice make perfect? Perfection is an ideal state that can never be achieved, but it's a goal that you're trying to go to. So perfection should always be what you're aiming for, but don't be frustrated if you're not perfect, because you're basically never gonna be. What practice does is it programs your subconscious so that under stress, you're still able to access it without consciously having to think about it. Human beings cannot multitask. The best thing you can do is you can stack tasks, which means you do A, then you pause, you do B, you switch back to A. You cannot do two things at the same time. So if you are trying to move, shoot, and communicate, and you have to focus on each of these tasks, you're gonna be screwed. At least you're gonna be very slow. So you have to try to make as many of these tasks subconscious, and we're gonna start off with movement. So while you're probably not gonna be able to achieve perfection, one thing you will be able to achieve is virtuosity. Virtuosity is if you're able to perform common tasks uncommonly well, or what's otherwise known as perfection in the basics. And how do you recognize virtuosity? I can't tell you, but you will know it when you see it. So as I mentioned before, we're trying to avoid overtraining, but we're still going to have to challenge our body all the time. And we're going to challenge it through progressive overload. Now, progressive overload sounds like you have to overload your muscles, but that's not the case. You just have to have an acceptable stimulus to elicit an increase in performance. Let's talk about the 80-20 principle. If you focus your effort on the most important 20%, you will get 80% of the result. So make sure you take your time and identify those 20% so that you're not wasting your energy. So mission-specific functional training will benefit your posture, which is the way we hold our bodies, your balance, which is maintaining a stable position in the environment, stability, which is the ability of your joints to withstand external shock, and mobility, which is the range of motion of each of your joints. And all of the above will decrease your chance for injury, both acute traumatic and chronic. Now let's talk about the overall concept of your training and all the things that need to be included in it. First up, warm-up. So what are we trying to achieve with our warm-up? First of all, we're trying to raise the core temperature. Secondly, we're trying to move our limbs and joints through all ranges of motion and all planes. And thirdly, we're trying to do that by using mission-relevant movements. We're going to include several mobility drills. The mobility drills will increase your range of motion and relax tight muscles, because if you're trying to work out with tight muscles and decrease range of motions, it's like driving a Ferrari with the handbrake on. Your body limits your range of motion to the range where you can safely operate in. For that reason, we are trying to increase your strength in the end range to use that to increase your mobility. We will include activation drills to wake up those muscles that are usually not used during the day because you have a sedentary lifestyle, mainly your butt. Your warm-up also needs to include dynamic warm-up exercises. And in the next episode, we have prepared for you a detailed dynamic warm-up that you can do at home. Next up, core training. Core strength is a primary developmental building block which absolutely has to be in place. Strength. Now, strength is divided into two parts. Absolute strength, which means the maximum amount of, for example, weight you are able to move, and relative strength, which means the weight you're able to move relative to your body weight. The stronger you are, the lighter the same resistance will feel, and the less energy overcoming the same resistance will cost you. So being stronger is always better. And 𝗪𝗵𝗫 says, strong people are harder to kill and more useful in general. Next up is power. Power is sometimes also called dynamic strength and is a combination of strength and speed, or the rate of force production. To increase athletic power, you want to be working on explosive strength from a dead start, dynamic strength during movement, and elastic athletic rebound ability. Elastic strength is usually trained through plyometrics training. Now, plyometrics training is very difficult to handle and has a very high rate of injury unless you have a good coach who knows exactly what he's doing. So don't do plyometrics training on your own. Next up is speed and quickness. Now, speed and quickness is about acceleration, deceleration, and change of direction. Where is that useful? Now, for example, if someone is shooting at you, you will have to get up, run very quickly, change direction, get down before he sees you, move a little bit, get up again, start accelerating, decelerating, change of direction into the next cover. You should also include different environmental challenges when you're training for that. For example, wet grass, snow, sand, and turf will all feel different and will affect how fast you can accelerate, decelerate, and change direction without landing on your butt. Agility and movement skills. Now, these skills will help you to get to the ground and back up, to navigate obstacles, and in general, to change your position. Endurance and energy systems. Now, your muscles work through adenosine triphosphate, which means that you can only perform contractions as long as you have ATP. ATP is reformed in your body through different energy systems. So the first system is the phosphagen system, which uses creatine phosphate that is stored in your muscles to rebuild ATP. Now, the problem is that you only have creatine phosphate for about 10 seconds or 10 repetitions stored in your muscle. After that, your body has to switch to the next system. The next system is the glycolytic anaerobic system, which uses glycogen and glucose to replenish the ATP. It does so, however, through forming a byproduct, which is lactic acid. The lactic acid will eventually slow you down, but still that system is good for about 20 minutes. The final system is the aerobic system. The aerobic system burns carbohydrates and fat and does not produce any harmful byproducts, which means theoretically that thing could run forever. Fat provides much more energy than carbohydrates, so it really would be preferable if you could just run on your fat. However, at high intensity, your body is usually not able to burn enough fat to give you the energy you need at that moment, unless you've taken the time to become keto adapted, which means you optimize your body for fat burning. So in order to train your endurance, you have to train all energy systems. Maybe not all equally, depending on what kind of tasks you're going to look at, but all of them have to be at a certain level. We're not going to talk about long, slow distance training, because long, slow distance training takes a long time to have effect and requires a lot of training time. So for the base part, you would actually look at doing 100+ miles every week. Instead, we're going to focus on high intensity interval training. High intensity interval training has not only been shown to be more effective in increasing endurance for short as well as long distances, but also to be way more efficient. Actually up to 20 times more efficient if you calculate the training time you would have to invest. Try to use task-specific movements for your endurance training, like rucking or maybe running, but not rowing or biking. If you need a low-impact alternative just for a change and to give your body a break, you can use swimming. Before you start the main part of your endurance training, you should do some skills and drills, which means you should work on your technique a little bit to improve your performance and reduce the chance for injury. As soon as the intensity of your training starts compromising your technique, you need to dial it down a little bit. There's no point in training wrong technique. During training, we will use shorter distances than the distance you are actually training for. So if you are training for a 5K run, we will probably do like 800 meters or 1500 meters and do repeats, but at a higher speed. Sometimes you will still use the original distance that you're going for to dial in your technique and work on your strategy and your pacing. Rocking. Rocking is one of the most important things to train for. No one I have asked or I have heard talk about selection has ever said, I wish I would have done less rocking. The most important thing about rocking are your feet, because when your feet get injured, there's no more rocking. Foot conditioning is extremely important for rocking because you want to prevent getting blisters. Now, in order to make your skin tougher, you actually have to rock. So you basically have to put in the kilometers in order to toughen up your feet. There's no way around it. In the beginning, you will find lots of hot spots on your feet. As soon as you find hot spots, put some moleskin patches around them so that you're not creating blisters and you can keep training. You need to try out several different ways of wearing socks. So whether you want to use thin socks, thick socks, or a combination of both, actually wearing one pair or two pairs of socks is different for everybody. So find what works best for you. Talking about boots. Obviously, the boots need to be comfortable. Now, new boots usually aren't. Does that mean they are a bad fit? Not necessarily. You probably have to just break them in. However, if after a while you still have problems with the boots, get some other boots. Maybe another model, or maybe they were just not the right size. You always should carry extra pairs of socks when you go rocking, because as soon as the socks get wet, the skin will be much less resistant and you will get blisters much more easily. Packing your ruck. You should always have the heavy weight high and close to your spine. Last thing, make sure your ruck doesn't look like a gypsy camp. So don't have stuff hanging off left and right, because that stuff, first of all, could catch on something. And the worst thing it could catch on is the cadre's attention, and you don't want extra attention. Next up, grip strength. So the grip is your limiting factor of how much force you can actually put into something. One minimum standard for grip strength is whether or not you can hang from a bar for 2 minutes. If you want to make that a little bit more challenging, you can alternate your grip every 30 seconds. During your strength training, don't use any straps or other gimmicks to help you with your grip strength. I also recommend training your grip strength with heavy carries. Besides that, no one does enough heavy carries, so you can't go wrong with heavy carries anyway. Speaking of heavy carries, there are many different versions to choose from. So you have the waiter walk, the suitcase walk, the farmer's walk, and the barrel carry. You can use them either at the end of a workout as a finisher or as a rest period within a workout where you're basically using the carry to recover your cardiovascular system. Since we were talking about finishers, the finisher I like best is the sled push to exhaustion. And thanks to Julian Pinot for that one. The sled push has the advantage that it does not have any eccentric movements, which means you will not be sore the next day and you can do it every day. You also will be able to always do one more step. So basically, you can only quit when your mind quits. So it's very good as a mental exercise as well as an endurance exercise. Let's talk a little bit about recovery, because with hard training, you usually sooner or later run into certain aches and pains that you need to take care of. One tool that you can use is a foam roller. Now, the foam roller is very good to relax large muscle groups, for example, the thighs. It's also quite useful to see if the upstream, downstream joints are sensitive to pressure. Because if the muscles around those joints are sensitive to pressure, that could be a clue as to whether that is actually the reason for the pain you're having. If you have problems with muscles that are not accessible by the foam roller because they are too small or they're covered with other muscles, you have to use a smaller implement. The best thing to use is a lacrosse ball because it has the hardness that's necessary compared to a tennis ball. The areas that are best to be hit by the lacrosse ball are the soles of the feet, the area around the hip joints, the back, especially around the shoulder blades, and the trapezius muscles. If you find sensitive spots there, they are usually trigger points. In order to treat a trigger point, you will have to put direct pressure with the lacrosse ball onto the trigger point. You have to go on a pain scale from 1 to 10 in the area of 8 or 9 and hold that pain until it subsides and gets below 6. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do anything positive with it. There's also a tool called the back buddy. Now hear me out, it's not what you think. It's a tool that allows you to basically reach every part of your body and put enough pressure on there to affect the trigger point. So I think it's a really cool tool and you should give it a shot. Ice baths are pretty popular, but under what circumstances are they actually useful for you? Now, ice baths are mainly used to reduce inflammation, especially on like multi-day events where after day 1 you jump into the ice bath in order to be in your best possible shape for day 2. The problem with an ice bath is that it will also dampen your training effect, because part of the training effect actually depends on the inflammation reaction. Another reason why you would use an ice bath is for cold adaptation. And for that, it's actually really good. However, just make sure that you have at least 48 hours of rest period between your last training and your ice bath in order to get the maximum effect from your training. If you have access to a sauna, by all means use it, because it creates heat shock proteins which aid in your recovery. Sleep is also extremely important for your recovery. Now, a good time frame for sleep is between 6.5 and 9 hours, but that depends on the person. You have to try out what time is working best for you, or what sleep length actually is working best for you. So, for example, 8 hours and you might wake up and feel refreshed, whereas at 7.5 and 8.5 hours, you're not feeling good, you're feeling tired. So you should try to stick with that time that you figure out is good for you. Another option is taking naps. Taking naps is actually in line with human development, because humans used to divide their sleep into several blocks. They didn't sleep in like one big 8-hour block. Make sure you get not only the right quantity, but also a good quality of your sleep. So you should not be exposed to any blue light, meaning mobile phone, TV, computer screen, for about 90 minutes before you're trying to sleep. The room where you sleep should be dark and there should not be any active electronics. So turn off your mobile phone or leave it outside. Breathing techniques. There are many different breathing techniques. I'm not a fan of anything in particular. Box breathing is very popular, which means you basically breathe in for a number of seconds, hold your breath for the same number of seconds, exhale for the same number of seconds, and hold your breath again for the same number of seconds. The number of seconds is up to you. It depends on the condition you're in. Just make sure that every step of the box breathing has the same number of seconds basically that you use. You can use any other breathing technique. Breathing techniques are a good way to control your breathing and lower your heart rate. Meditation is another good way to increase your recovery, because meditation techniques will actually help you relax your whole body and may be able, if you're good enough, to increase the blood flow to the areas that need it most, because the blood flow follows your awareness. Nutrition is split into food and supplements. Now, what do I mean when I say food? Food is stuff that is not in packages. Everything that is in packages is not food, it's a product, because it has been produced, which means it usually has lost quite a few of the minerals and vitamins that used to be in there. The two most important things to cut out of your diet are sugar and alcohol. What kind of supplements would be useful for you? Now, I'm not a big fan of supplements because I prefer to get my nutrition from real food. However, I would recommend, in case you can't get enough good quality food, that you use some sort of vitamin and mineral supplement. If you decide to use any other supplements, just make sure you try them out before you go to selection. A lot of those supplements, especially pre-workout supplements, can have quite a lot of side effects. And if you never tried them out and they catch you and hit you with headaches, cramps, or diarrhea, you're pretty much screwed. The final thing you have to do is you have to do a trial run for the physical standards before you go to selection. A trial run is when you actually do all the different steps of the physical fitness test in the exact same order with the exact same rest periods. Otherwise, you will not have a good idea of whether you'll actually be able to make it. Now I understand if you want to do your test run for the physical standards test under the best possible conditions. And that's okay. But just keep in mind that when you're going to selection, you will probably not have optimal conditions. You might be tired, you might be exhausted from stuff that you have been doing before that nobody will tell you. You might be stressed, you might not be well rested because of the stress, you couldn't sleep the night before, and so on. It might be raining, the terrain may be different than what you trained for. Just keep that in mind when you're running your trial run and try not to be anywhere near the minimum standards.